I'd lived by the fjord my whole life. Born and raised in the same small village where the population never seemed to grow, just a slow churn of the same faces, some aging, some disappearing, and the occasional newcomer who never stayed long. The landscape was as familiar to me as the back of my own hand. The steep cliffs looming above the glassy water, the pine forests blanketing the hillsides, and of course the fog that seemed to roll in like clockwork, thick and heavy, swallowing the world whole. There was something about the silence that came with it. In the city, even at night, there was noise, cars, people, life. But here, the silence was like a living thing. It wrapped itself around you, pressing against your ears until you could hear your own heartbeat pounding like a drum in your chest. I used to love that stillness. It was peaceful, calming even. But in the last few months, that peace had begun to feel oppressive, like the quiet was watching, waiting for something to happen. The fishing was always good in the fjord, and I had my routine down to a science. Early mornings spent out on the water, the sun barely cresting over the horizon, the only sound the creak of the oars in the rowlocks and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. By noon, I'd haul in my nets, return to shore, and head back to the village to sell my catch. It wasn't much of a living, but it kept me fed and housed. I didn't need much else. But there were whispers, always whispers, about the water. Stories the old folks would tell when they thought no one was listening. I'd heard them all growing up, the Nøkk, the water spirit that lived in the fjord, luring people to their deaths with its haunting song. My grandmother used to warn me not to go out on the water when the fog was thick, not to follow the sounds of the music if I heard it. "That's how it gets you," she'd say, her eyes dark and wide, as if she'd seen the Nøkk herself. I never believed it, of course. Superstition, old tales. But that didn't stop the feeling of unease from creeping in whenever I found myself alone on the water in the fog, when the world felt small and suffocating. Lately, though, that unease had become harder to shake. The fog seemed to hang around longer these days, settling in like an unwanted guest. The water, once my sanctuary, had begun to feel strange, off, like it was waiting for something. It was on one of those foggy mornings, the kind where you can't see more than a few feet in front of you, that I first heard it. I was out early, as usual, rowing toward the deeper part of the fjord, when a faint melody drifted through the mist. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just the wind catching in the cliffs in some weird way. But then it grew louder, clearer, a soft, lilting tune, like a woman's voice humming just out of reach. I stopped rowing, letting the boat drift. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear exactly, but something close to it. A kind of nervous anticipation, the way you feel when you know you're about to stumble onto something you shouldn't. The song, because that's what it was, I realized, carried on the still air, echoing off the water in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I strained to listen, leaning forward as if that would somehow help me hear it better. The song was beautiful, achingly so. It made me want to close my eyes and let it wash over me, let it pull me into the fog until I couldn't tell where the world ended and the water began. I blinked, suddenly aware that I'd been sitting motionless for far too long. The oars sat heavy in my hands, forgotten. Shaking myself out of it, I started rowing again, faster this time. The music faded as I moved, the fog swallowing the sound as easily as it had swallowed the cliffs. I told myself it was just a trick of the wind, a coincidence. But that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I could still hear it, faint and distant, the melody curling around the edges of my mind, refusing to let go. The next few days, I tried to push the memory of that eerie melody from my mind, but it lingered like a bad dream you can't quite shake. I'd be out on the fjord doing my usual rounds, and I'd catch myself listening for it, ears straining for that distant song. But each time, the waters were silent, and I'd convince myself it had all been a figment of my imagination, just the fog playing tricks on me. Then it happened again. It was late in the evening, the kind of night where the fog rolled in thick and fast, covering everything in a damp, muffling blanket. The village lights were barely visible through the haze, and the world had shrunk down to just my boat and the slow ripple of water around me. I wasn't even far from shore, maybe a few hundred meters, but it felt like I was adrift in a sea of nothingness. No landmarks, no sense of direction, just the cold, still air pressing in on me from all sides. And then, there it was. That song. At first it was so faint I thought it was my imagination again, but as I sat still in the boat, the melody grew louder, clearer. The same soft, lilting tune as before, only this time it seemed closer. Too close. The notes drifted on the air, delicate and strange, wrapping around me like tendrils of fog. I found myself leaning toward the sound, straining to hear it better. There was something about the way it rose and fell that made me want to follow it, to let it guide me deeper into the mist. I caught myself just before I reached for the oars. What was I thinking? I was chasing a song, a ghostly tune in the fog, as if that made any kind of sense. But even as I sat there, my pulse racing, I couldn't tear my mind away from it. The music wasn't just beautiful. It was haunting, like it was calling me, pulling at something deep inside me. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a longing I couldn't explain. The old stories about the Nøkk came rushing back. Unwanted but undeniable. A water spirit, they said, a creature that lured people into the depths with its song. I'd always laughed off those tales, chalking them up to superstition and fear of the unknown. But here I was, sitting in the middle of a fog-choked fjord, hearing a melody that had no business existing. And despite myself, I was tempted to see where the song would lead. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to have settled in my brain as much as around me. This was madness. I needed to get back to shore, back to solid ground where things made sense. But my hands wouldn't move. The oars sat heavy in the boat, useless as my heart hammered in my chest. And then, through the mist, I saw something. A shape in the water, moving just beneath the surface. It was quick, just a flicker of motion, but it was enough to jolt me back to reality. My breath caught in my throat, and I stared at the spot where the shape had been, willing it to be gone, to have been nothing more than a trick of the light. But the water was still now, the ripples fading away as if nothing had disturbed it at all. But I knew better. Something had been there, moving just under the boat, watching. And in the same moment, I realized the song had stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. The air felt thicker, colder, like the world had shifted in some imperceptible way. I gripped the oars, my fingers numb from the cold, and forced myself to start rowing. Every muscle in my body screamed to move faster, to get away from whatever was lurking beneath the surface. The boat cut through the water, and as I rowed, I glanced back over my shoulder toward the spot where I'd seen the movement. There was nothing there, just fog and water, endless and quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the thing in the water wasn't done with me yet. By the time I reached the shore, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie the boat to the dock. I stumbled up the path toward my cabin, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see something rise from the fjord and follow me onto land. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and sat down hard on the edge of my bed. My heart was still racing, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The house was quiet, the walls closing in around me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the song, no, the Nøkk, was still out there, waiting. The water had always been my refuge, a place where I could escape the world. But now, for the first time, it felt like a threat. And I couldn't help but wonder if the Nøkk was waiting for me to return. The days after that second encounter felt different. The village seemed quieter, more subdued, as if the thick fog that clung to the fjord had soaked into everyone's bones. People went about their business as usual, fishing, fixing their boats, gathering around the tavern for a drink. But there was a tension in the air, like we were all waiting for something to happen, something we couldn't quite put our finger on. I found myself staring out at the water more often than not, my eyes drawn to the smooth gray surface of the fjord. I couldn't stop thinking about that melody, how it had seemed to wrap itself around me, pulling me toward the depths, and that shape in the water. It had been real. I knew it. My mind had replayed it 100 times since that night. But no matter how many times I tried to rationalize it, some kind of fish, maybe, or a trick of the light, I knew, deep down, that wasn't the case. The old stories about the Nøkk, the ones I'd brushed off for years, started to feel more like warnings. The villagers didn't talk much about the Nøkk anymore, but I remembered the way my grandmother had told me when I was young, never to trust the waters on foggy nights. The Nøkk sings to those who will listen, she'd said, her voice low and serious. It wants to pull you in, take you where you'll never come back. I hadn't believed her then, but now, it was a few days later when I first saw it again, more clearly this time. The fog had rolled in thick that afternoon, and by evening, the world outside my cabin was hidden behind a heavy white curtain. I hadn't planned on going out on the water, not with the way things had been gnawing at my mind, but something pulled me toward the boat. I don't know if it was curiosity, stupidity, or something more insidious. Either way, I found myself rowing out into the fjord as the last traces of daylight disappeared. The silence was thick, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan around you. My boat moved steadily through the water, the oars cutting cleanly through the surface, and the fog wrapped itself around me like a blanket. I didn't know what I was looking for, or why I had come out there in the first place, but I felt like something was waiting for me. And then, through the fog, I heard it again. That same haunting melody, drifting over the water, as soft and beautiful as before. My breath caught in my throat, and my hands froze on the oars. The song was clearer this time, more defined. I could hear the notes rise and fall, like a voice calling to me from somewhere deep beneath the surface. I felt that pull again, the one that made me want to let go of everything and follow the sound, to disappear into the mist and let it take me wherever it wanted to. But this time I fought it. I tightened my grip on the oars, my knuckles white, and forced myself to sit still. The boat rocked gently in the water, but I didn't move. I just listened. And that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a ripple, a small disturbance in the otherwise calm surface of the fjord. But then the ripple grew, spreading outward like something large was moving just beneath the surface. I squinted into the fog, my heart hammering in my chest, and then, there it was, the Nøkk. It wasn't just a shadow or a glimpse of movement this time. It was a figure, just below the water, its form shifting and shimmering in the dim light. At first, it looked like a person, long limbs, a slender body, and hair floating like seaweed around its head. But then it moved, and the shape twisted into something else, something that wasn't human at all. Its body seemed to merge with the water itself, its edges soft and fluid, like it was made of the fjord. The Nøkk's eyes caught mine, glowing faintly from beneath the surface. I felt that pull again, stronger now, like a hook buried deep in my chest. It wanted me. I could feel it. The music grew louder, more insistent, and for a moment I felt my grip on reality slip. The oars fell from my hands, and I leaned forward, my body moving of its own accord, drawn toward the water. I wanted to go to it. I wanted to follow the song, to sink beneath the surface and let the Nøkk take me. But something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was instinct, but I snapped back to myself just in time. I scrambled to grab the oars, my hands shaking as I began to row, hard and fast, away from the figure in the water. The music faded as I moved, but the image of the Nøkk's shifting form stayed with me, burned into my mind. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. And I knew this wasn't the last time I'd see it. After that night, everything changed. It wasn't just me, though I certainly wasn't the same after staring into those glowing eyes beneath the water. No, it was the whole village. There was a sense of unease that seemed to creep into every conversation, every glance exchanged between neighbors. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable, like a bad feeling hanging in the air. But soon, the fog wasn't the only thing that made life around the fjord heavy. People started disappearing. It began with Jørgen, one of the older fishermen. He'd been fishing these waters for longer than I'd been alive, and nothing ever rattled him. One morning, I walked down to the dock and noticed his boat wasn't there. Normally, he'd be the first out, already hauling in his catch by the time the rest of us got going. But that morning, his boat never left the harbor. At first, everyone assumed he was sick or had taken a rare day off. But when he didn't show up by noon, his wife went looking for him. They found his boat later that afternoon, floating a few hundred meters from shore, empty. No sign of Jørgen, no sign of a struggle, just his boat, bobbing lightly in the water, abandoned. The village buzzed with rumors, though no one said it outright. A man as experienced as Jørgen wouldn't just fall overboard, and even if he had, he knew those waters like the back of his hand. He would have been able to swim back to shore, no problem. But there were no answers, only that terrible silence hanging over the fjord, thicker than the fog. I knew better, though. I hadn't seen the Nøkk since that night, but I could feel it. The pull was stronger now, more insistent. I tried to stay away from the water, but it was like a magnet, drawing me in. I couldn't escape it, not really. Not when the song still hummed faintly in my head, even when I was miles from the shore. A few days later, it happened again. This time, it was a young woman named Ellen, newly married and barely in her 20s. She'd been walking home from visiting her mother when she vanished. Her husband found her shoes neatly placed by the water's edge, as if she'd decided to wade into the fjord in the dead of night. The village searched the shoreline for days, but they never found her, and still, no one spoke the name of the Nøkk. But the fear was there, lurking just beneath the surface, as palpable as the cold wind that swept off the water. People started staying inside more. The docks, once bustling with activity, now felt abandoned. Some said it was the fog, that the weather was to blame. Others said it was just coincidence, bad luck. But I could see it in their eyes. They knew something was wrong. I tried to talk to Lars, the village elder, about what I'd seen. He'd been around long enough to know the old stories, to remember the tales whispered by his parents and grandparents. He didn't look surprised when I mentioned the Nøkk. His face went pale, his eyes dark and distant, as if he'd been waiting for someone to bring it up. "We don't speak of it," he said, his voice low and rough, like the very words could summon something terrible. "Speaking its name gives it power. Acknowledge it, and it comes for you." I pressed him, telling him about the song, about the figure I'd seen beneath the water. He nodded, but his expression didn't change. "You were lucky," he said. "Most who hear the song don't come back." Lucky. That word rattled around in my head for days after. Was that what I was? Lucky? I didn't feel lucky. I felt like I was walking on a razor's edge, with the Nøkk pulling at me from one side, and something worse, something darker, waiting on the other. And it wasn't just me. The disappearances continued. It was never the same type of person, never the same circumstances. Sometimes it was a fisherman out on his boat, sometimes it was a farmer walking home late, and sometimes it was a child playing too close to the shore. But the pattern was unmistakable. Each one disappeared near the water, each one leaving behind nothing but a trace, a boat, a shoe, a scarf caught on a rock. The village grew quieter. People spoke in hushed tones, and the tavern, once lively with fishermen swapping stories, now sat half empty most nights. No one went out on the fjord after dark. Even during the day, you could see the hesitation in people's eyes as they cast their nets, as if waiting for something to rise from the depths and pull them under. I started to feel like I was the only one who could see the whole picture, the only one who understood what was really happening. And that thought terrified me, because if the Nøkk was coming for the village, what could I do to stop it? Nothing. I couldn't escape the pull of the fjord. No matter how much I tried to distance myself from it, something always drew me back to the water. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was deeper, darker. I started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing the faint hum of that haunting melody, even though I was far from the shore. It was in my dreams, echoing through the walls of my cabin, beckoning me like an unshakable shadow. The disappearances continued, but I had stopped talking about the Nøkk to anyone. What good would it do? They already knew, even if they refused to admit it. The village had fallen into a kind of silent, shared understanding. Everyone knew the fjord had become dangerous, but no one wanted to speak the truth aloud. We all kept to ourselves, avoiding the water as much as possible, but the Nøkk's presence hung over us like a cloud, thick and oppressive. I became obsessed. I couldn't help it. I spent every spare moment by the shore, staring out at the water, waiting. Part of me wanted to see the Nøkk again, to understand what it wanted, but the other part was terrified of what that understanding might cost me. I stopped going to the tavern, stopped meeting with the other fishermen. I didn't care about their stories or their quiet resignation anymore. I had my own mission. The worst part was that I wasn't sure whether I was trying to resist the Nøkk or let it pull me in. Every night I found myself walking toward the fjord, almost without realizing it. I'd be standing at the water's edge, staring out into the fog, my heart racing, my mind buzzing with the echo of that damned song. I didn't even remember leaving the cabin most of the time. It was like something was guiding me, pushing me forward, even though my instincts screamed for me to stay away. The fog was thicker than ever now, rolling in early in the evening and lingering long into the next morning. It was like a living thing, creeping over the water, swallowing the village one house at a time. It muffled everything, sound, sight, even thought. Some nights, I'd stand by the water, listening to the fog swirl around me, waiting for the song to begin again. Then it did. I remember the night so clearly. The village was already asleep, the windows dark, the streets empty. I don't even remember leaving my cabin, but I was there again, standing on the dock, staring out into the void. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, but I could hear it. The melody, soft at first, then louder, more insistent, like it was coming from deep within the fjord, pulling at me. I knew it was the Nøkk. I didn't have to see it to know it was there, watching me from beneath the surface, waiting. I felt the pull in my chest, like an invisible hand reaching inside me, tugging me toward the water. The song wrapped around me, sweet and intoxicating, filling my head with promises I couldn't quite understand. For a moment, I let myself lean into it. I took a step toward the edge of the dock, then another. The fog curled around me, and the song grew louder, clearer. I could feel the water lapping at my feet, cold and inviting, and I felt the overwhelming urge to step into it, to let it swallow me whole. But then I heard something else. A voice, sharp and urgent, cutting through the fog like a knife. I froze, the spell broken. I turned around and saw Lars, the village elder, standing at the edge of the dock. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Get back," he said, his voice rough, almost pleading. "Don't let it take you." I blinked, the fog suddenly seeming to clear from my mind, and I stumbled backward, away from the water. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling as I realized how close I had come to stepping off that dock and into the fjord. How close I had come to answering the Nøkk's call. Lars grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the shore. His grip was strong, stronger than I'd expected from an old man, and I was grateful for it. I didn't resist. I let him lead me away, the song fading behind me, swallowed by the fog. When we were back on solid ground, he finally let go, but his face was still pale, his eyes dark with something I didn't recognize. Fear, maybe, or something worse. "You're not the first," he said quietly, his voice shaking, "and you won't be the last." I didn't say anything. What could I say? He was right. The Nøkk wasn't done with me. I knew that now. It had let me go this time, but it wouldn't stop. The pull was still there, stronger than ever. The song was still in my head, waiting, and one day I knew I wouldn't be able to resist it. That night with Lars was a turning point. I could feel the shift in my bones, a deep-rooted certainty that things were no longer in my control. I stayed away from the fjord for as long as I could after that, but it didn't matter. The Nøkk had sunk its claws into me, and no amount of distance could shake its grip. The melody still lingered in the back of my mind, faint but insistent, like a song you hear once and can't forget, no matter how hard you try. Lars hadn't said much after he pulled me from the dock, but his words haunted me. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." I tried to talk to him the next day, but he avoided me, just like everyone else had started to do. It wasn't an overt thing. No one came right out and told me to stay away. They didn't need to. I could see it in their eyes, the way they'd glance at me, then look quickly away. The way conversations fell into silence when I walked by. It was like they knew something I didn't, and they were waiting for it to unfold. The disappearances kept happening, one by one. It wasn't every day, or even every week, but it was steady enough to keep everyone on edge. Another fisherman, an elderly woman, a young boy who had wandered too close to the water. No bodies ever washed up. No one ever came back. Just the same story, over and over. Someone would be there, then they wouldn't. They'd vanish, swallowed by the fog, by the water, by the Nøkk. I could see the fear settling over the village like a second skin. People went out less, and when they did, they stuck together in pairs or small groups. The once bustling dock now stood eerily quiet most days. Boats stayed moored, tied tight, as though that thin rope could somehow keep them safe from what lurked beneath the surface of the fjord. And then there was me, alone, always alone, wandering the edge of the water at night when I knew I shouldn't. I didn't want to, but it was like my feet moved of their own accord. The nights when the fog rolled in the thickest were the worst. I'd find myself standing on the shore, staring out into the gray nothingness, the faint melody swirling around me like a siren's call. Each time I felt myself edging closer, fighting the pull, but barely. I couldn't shake the feeling that the Nøkk was watching me, waiting for the right moment to drag me under. It was like a cat playing with a mouse, letting me squirm, letting me think I had a chance to escape, but always ready to pounce. The night I finally decided to face it was like any other. Fog hanging thick over the fjord, the air cold and damp, the village asleep behind me. But something felt different that night. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of finality. I knew, deep down, that this was it. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep pretending I could resist forever. The song started again. Soft at first, barely more than a whisper on the wind. But it grew louder as I walked toward the water, as I stepped onto the dock, the wooden planks creaking beneath my feet. The melody was beautiful, achingly so. And this time I didn't fight it. I let it wash over me, filling my mind, drowning out every other thought. I reached the edge of the dock and stared down into the water. It was dark, almost black, and the fog swirled just above the surface, so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. But I knew it was there, the Nøkk, waiting. I stood there for what felt like hours, the song wrapping around me like a blanket, pulling me closer. My heart pounded in my chest, but I wasn't scared. Not anymore. There was something almost peaceful about it, a kind of inevitability that I'd come to accept. And then I saw it. The water rippled just slightly at first, then more violently. The Nøkk rose from the depths, its form shifting and shimmering in the moonlight. It looked like a person at first, tall, slender, with hair that floated like seaweed around its head, but then it changed. Its body twisted, elongated, becoming part of the water, part of the fog. Its eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto mine, and I felt the pull again, stronger than ever. But this time, I didn't resist. I stepped forward, my feet slipping off the edge of the dock and into the icy water. The cold hit me like a shock, but the song was louder now, filling my ears, my mind. The Nøkk reached for me, its fingers like tendrils of fog, wrapping around my arms, pulling me down. And as the water closed over my head, as the cold seeped into my bones, the last thing I heard was the Nøkk's song, beautiful and terrible, echoing in the dark. It had finally taken me. The water was so cold, it felt like knives piercing through every inch of my skin. For a split second, I panicked. My body rebelled against the icy grip pulling me down, instincts screaming at me to swim up, to fight for air, for life. But the Nøkk's song filled my head, drowning out everything else. It wasn't just a melody anymore, it was a presence, an overwhelming force that suffocated my thoughts, leaving only the deep, unbearable need to let go. I stopped struggling. I don't know how long I was under, seconds, maybe minutes. It didn't feel like drowning. There was no burning in my lungs, no dodhood, no desperate gasps for air. Instead, the cold numbed everything, pulling me into a strange, almost dreamlike state. The fog above seemed to stretch downward, swirling around me as I sank deeper into the fjord. Everything was muted, the world outside fading away into the cold blackness of the water. The Nøkk was there, always just out of reach, its form shifting and blending into the murky depths. Sometimes it looked human, its eyes glowing faintly like distant lanterns, its hair drifting in the water like the seaweed that lined the shore. Other times, it became part of the water itself, its body stretching out in impossible ways, bending and twisting with the currents. It didn't speak, not in words, but I could feel it in my mind, pressing against my thoughts like a vice. It wasn't just a creature. It was the water, the fog, the ancient, unknowable force that had always been here, lurking beneath the surface of the fjord. I understood then why no one came back. Once the Nøkk had you, there was no escape. But even in that cold, dark place, some part of me held on. There was a faint flicker of resistance, a small, stubborn part of my mind that refused to give in. I thought about Lars, about the people in the village, about the disappearances, the quiet fear that had crept into our lives like a sickness. I thought about how the Nøkk had been playing with me, drawing me closer and closer, and how, despite everything, I hadn't been able to resist. But was this really it? Was this how it ended? Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was more like a gut reaction, a surge of panic that burst through the fog clouding my thoughts. My body jerked, muscles tensing, as if my survival instincts had finally broken through the Nøkk's spell. My arms flailed and I kicked against the water, my lungs suddenly desperate for air. For the first time, the Nøkk reacted. Its glowing eyes flared, and I felt its grip tighten, cold and unyielding. It pulled harder, dragging me deeper, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then I saw something, faint, just at the edge of my vision. Light. I kicked again, harder this time, and the Nøkk's grip loosened just slightly. The light grew brighter, cutting through the water like a beacon. I twisted, fighting against the pull, and as I did, I felt something shift. The water grew warmer, the song quieter. The Nøkk's form flickered as if the light was burning it away, weakening it. I pushed upward, my chest burning, my vision narrowing. My hands broke the surface first, then my head, and I gasped, choking on the cold night air. The fog was still thick, clinging to me like a second skin, but the Nøkk was gone. I flailed for the dock, dragging myself out of the water with shaking hands. My body was numb, my mind reeling, and for a long moment, I just lay there, staring up at the sky, struggling to breathe. The world felt distant, surreal, as if I'd crossed some invisible line and wasn't supposed to come back. The song was gone. Silence hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. The fog was still thick, swirling lazily around the dock, but it felt different now, hollow, empty. I sat up slowly, my limbs heavy, my skin clammy with cold. The village lights flickered faintly in the distance, but everything else was still. No one had come looking for me. No one had seen. The Nøkk hadn't taken me, but it wasn't over. I knew it was still out there, lurking beneath the water, waiting for the next time the fog rolled in. It had let me go, for now, but I could feel its presence just beneath the surface, watching. And I knew without a doubt that it would try again. Not just with me, but with anyone who dared to listen to its song. The cold lingered in my bones as I stood on the dock, staring out at the fjord. The water rippled softly, innocent and unthreatening. But I knew better now. The Nøkk wasn't done with me, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. The days that followed felt like they belonged to someone else's life, not mine. I went through the motions of living, tending to the boat, walking through the village, exchanging hollow words with the few people I still spoke to, but I wasn't really there. My body was going through the actions, but my mind was somewhere else, stuck in that cold, dark water. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The Nøkk's glowing eyes, its shifting form, the way it pulled me under like I was nothing but a leaf on the surface of the fjord. The village didn't ask questions. They never did. Maybe they knew something had happened, maybe they didn't. But after so many disappearances, there was an unspoken agreement not to pry into each other's lives too deeply. We all had our own ghosts to deal with. No one needed more. The fog had lifted for a few days, giving us a brief reprieve, but I knew it wouldn't last. The weather had always been unpredictable around here, but this felt different. The fog wasn't just a natural occurrence. It was part of the Nøkk's presence. It came and went like a warning, a reminder that we were never truly safe. I avoided the water as much as I could. I didn't go out on the boat, didn't even walk by the shore. But it didn't matter. The Nøkk was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, its song a faint whisper that never fully faded. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening for it. Sometimes I'd hear the echoes, far off in the distance, and my body would tense, knowing what was coming. And then, one evening, the fog rolled in again. It was thicker than before, creeping over the village like a living thing, swallowing the houses one by one. The streetlights barely penetrated the haze, casting weak, watery beams into the mist. The village was quiet, eerily so. No one was outside. They all knew better by now, but I couldn't stay inside. I knew what was waiting for me out there, and yet some part of me, a part I couldn't control, compelled me to go. I pulled on my coat and stepped out into the fog, my heart already pounding in my chest. The cold air bit at my skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill I felt inside, the same one that had taken root since that night in the water. I didn't know where I was going, not at first. My feet moved on their own, carrying me through the village, down the narrow path toward the fjord. The fog grew thicker the closer I got, swirling around me, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But I didn't need to see. I knew exactly where I was headed. The dock appeared out of the mist like a ghost, the old wooden planks creaking under my boots as I stepped onto it. The water was still, impossibly calm, as if it was waiting for something. For me. I stood at the edge of the dock, staring down into the black water, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The fog curled around me, thick and heavy, pressing in on all sides. And then I heard it. The song. It started soft, just a faint melody carried on the wind, but it grew louder, filling the air, filling my head. The Nøkk song, beautiful and terrible, calling to me. My pulse quickened, and I felt that pull again, the same one I'd fought against for so long. But this time, I didn't fight it. I couldn't. I stared into the water, and there it was, just beneath the surface, its glowing eyes fixed on me, its form shifting, blending with the dark currents of the fjord. The Nøkk didn't move. It didn't need to. The song was enough. I took a step forward, my boots slipping on the damp wood. The water lapped gently against the dock, as if inviting me in, and I knew without a doubt that this time, there was no escaping it. The Nøkk had waited long enough. It had toyed with me, given me a taste of its power, and now it wanted more. It wanted all of me. My foot hovered over the edge of the dock, the cold air rushing up from the water, stinging my skin. My body trembled, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming urge to let go, to give in. The song was so loud now, so insistent that I couldn't hear anything else. It drowned out my thoughts, my fears, everything. And then I stepped forward. The water closed over me, and this time I didn't fight it. There was no struggle, no panic, just the cold, dark embrace of the fjord and the Nøkk song, pulling me down, down, down into the depths. As I sank into the blackness, the last thing I saw was the faint glow of its eyes, watching, waiting. And then there was nothing. The village would wake up the next morning and find the dock empty, my boat tied up as it always was. They wouldn't ask where I'd gone. They already knew.